I stormed into the house, suitcase in hand, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The living room had been rearranged, with our familiar furniture replaced by sleek, modern pieces that clashed with the cozy vibe we had cultivated over the years. "Braden," I called out, my voice carrying an edge of frustration. "What's going on here?" He emerged from the kitchen, a sheepish grin plastered across his face. "Melina, you're back early. Welcome home, honey." I narrowed my eyes, taking in his nervous demeanor. "Don't honey me. What did you do to our living room?" Braden rubbed the back of his neck, a telltale sign that he was hiding something. "Well, you see, I had this brilliant idea while you were away." Before he could finish, my gaze landed on the empty spot where my prized vintage camera collection once stood. A sinking feeling gripped my stomach as I realized the significance of their absence. "Where are my cameras, Braden?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He averted his eyes, and in that moment, I knew the truth. "You were supposed to safeguard my past, not auction it off, Braden." The words tumbled out, laced with hurt and betrayal. Those cameras weren't just possessions. They were a connection to my late father, a cherished family heirloom passed down through generations. Braden's expression hardened, and he met my gaze with a defiant stare. "They were just collecting dust, Melina. I needed the money to finance my new business venture." I recoiled as if struck, the weight of his callous disregard for something so precious to me hitting me like a ton of bricks. In that instant, I realized that the man standing before me was no longer the person I thought I knew. "A business venture?" I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You sold my family's heirlooms without even consulting me." Braden scoffed, his arms folded across his chest in a defensive posture. "Don't be so dramatic, Melina. They were just a bunch of old cameras gathering dust." His dismissive attitude felt like a slap in the face. How could he be so callous about something that meant the world to me? "Those cameras were priceless, Braden. They've been in my family for generations." "Exactly," he retorted, his voice rising. "Your family's junk, not mine. I'm tired of living in the shadows of your success, always relying on your income to get by." I stared at him, dumbfounded by the venom in his words. This wasn't the man I had married, the one who had once supported my dreams and ambitions. "So you decided to sell off my belongings behind my back?" I asked, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "How could you betray my trust like that?" Braden's expression hardened, and he took a step closer, his eyes narrowed. "Don't act so innocent, Melina. You're always away on business trips, leaving me to fend for myself. I needed the money to get my own venture off the ground, and those cameras were just sitting there, collecting dust." I shook my head in disbelief, my heart sinking as the full extent of his selfishness became apparent. "You had no right to sell them, Braden. Those cameras were worth more than just money to me." "Well, maybe it's time you let go of the past and focus on the future," he sneered. "I'm done living in your shadow, Melina. I'm going to make something of myself with or without your approval." His words cut deep, and I felt a surge of anger and hurt well up inside me. How could the man I had loved and trusted for so many years have turned into this twisted, self-serving stranger? "You know what, Braden?" I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Maybe you're right. It's time we both move on and focus on our futures, separately." His eyes widened, and for a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced by a smug grin, as if he had already written me off. "Suit yourself, Melina," he said, his tone dripping with disdain, "but don't come crawling back when you realize you've made a mistake." With those words, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the hollow remains of what was once our home, my heart shattered into a million pieces. In that moment, I knew that our marriage was well and truly over, and that the only way forward was to make him pay for his betrayal. In the days following my confrontation with Braden, a cold fury settled deep within me. As the shock of his betrayal wore off, it was replaced by a burning desire for justice and revenge. I couldn't let him get away with what he had done, not just for my sake, but for the sake of my family's legacy. Those cameras had been passed down through generations, and he had callously sold them off like they were worthless trinkets. It was time to take action. I reached out to Delia Hampson, a sharp-witted lawyer who had handled legal matters for my family in the past. She agreed to meet me at a local cafe, and as I sipped my coffee, I laid out the entire sordid tale. Delia listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. Braden really stepped in it this time, didn't he? I nodded, a humorless smile tugging at my lips. That's an understatement. He not only sold my belongings without my consent, but he also violated our rental agreement by turning our home into an illegal Airbnb. Delia's eyes widened. He did what? I explained how Braden had remodeled our living room to cater to short-term guests, all while I was away on business trips. He had even set up an Airbnb listing, complete with glowing reviews from unsuspecting travelers. That's a clear breach of contract, Delia said, her voice laced with disbelief. Not to mention the unauthorized sale of your personal property. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. Melina, you have grounds to sue him for not just the value of those cameras, but also for emotional distress and breach of trust. A spark of hope ignited within me. Finally, I had a way to make Braden pay for what he had done. What do I need to do? I asked, my voice steady and determined. Delia outlined the steps, explaining that I would need to gather as much evidence as possible. Financial records, guest logs, anything that could prove Braden's misdeeds. Don't worry, I said, a steely resolve settling over me. I'll get everything we need to bury him. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly, gathering information and documentation on Braden's illegal activities. I even reached out to some of his disgruntled Airbnb guests who were more than happy to provide testimonials about the subpar conditions they had endured. Throughout it all, Braden remained oblivious to my efforts, too caught up in his own delusions of grandeur to notice the storm brewing around him. But soon, very soon, he would realize the gravity of his mistakes, and the price he would have to pay for betraying my trust. As the days passed, Braden began to sense that something was amiss. He would catch me on the phone, quickly ending my conversations whenever he entered the room. And there were the hushed meetings with Delia, where we would pore over the mountain of evidence I had accumulated. One evening, as I was reviewing some financial statements, Braden barged into the study, his face flushed with anger. "What are you up to, Melina?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he took in the papers strewn across the desk. I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "Just tying up some loose ends," I replied coolly. Braden scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you've been meeting with that lawyer friend of yours." A flicker of unease crossed his features, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "Let me guess, you're trying to find a way to screw me over and take everything for yourself?" I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer audacity of his accusation. "You have a lot of nerve, Braden. After everything you've done, you really think you have the moral high ground here?" His eyes flashed with fury, and he took a step closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "I did what I had to do to get my business off the ground. You were never around, too busy with your fancy job to care about what was going on at home." "That's no excuse for betraying my trust and violating our rental agreement," I shot back, refusing to back down. "You had no right to sell my belongings or turn our home into an illegal Airbnb." Braden's face contorted with rage, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out physically. But then, just as quickly, his expression shifted to one of smug indifference. "Go ahead and try to take me down, Melina," he sneered. "I've covered my tracks. You'll never be able to prove anything." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving me seething in his wake. But even as his footsteps faded down the hall, I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. Because despite his bravado, I knew that I had him cornered. Over the next few days, I doubled down on my efforts, scouring every financial record and gathering testimonials from disgruntled Airbnb guests who had been misled by Braden's deception. And as the evidence mounted, my resolve only grew stronger. Braden had made a grave mistake in underestimating me, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. I was done playing by his rules. It was time to take him down, and make him pay for every ounce of pain and betrayal he had inflicted upon me. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. I had gathered all the evidence, financial records, guest testimonials, even pictures of the renovations Braden had made to our home without my consent. It was an airtight case, and I knew it. As I sat across from Braden at the kitchen table, the weight of the documents in my hands felt like a weapon, ready to be unleashed. His eyes narrowed as he took in the stack of papers, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his features. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone laced with suspicion. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the confrontation ahead. "This is your chance to come clean, Braden, to admit what you've done and make things right." He scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. "And why would I do that?" "Because if you don't," I said, sliding the papers across the table towards him, "I'll have no choice but to take legal action." Braden's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents, his cocky demeanor quickly crumbling. I watched as the realization of the evidence against him sank in, his face paling with every damning page. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "I'm dead serious," I replied, my voice steely with resolve. "You betrayed my trust, Braden. You sold my family's heirlooms and turned our home into an illegal Airbnb business without my knowledge or consent." He opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it. I have proof of everything. The unauthorized renovations, the Airbnb listings, even testimonials from guests who were misled about the conditions of their stay. You've violated our rental agreement and deprived me of my personal property. It's all here, in black and white." Braden's eyes darted from side to side, his mind no doubt racing to find a way out of this mess. But there was no escape. Not this time. "So here's your choice," I continued, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You can either agree to settle this amicably, return what's left of the camera collection, pay me back for their value, and resign yourself to the consequences of your actions. Or I file this lawsuit and drag your name through the mud, exposing every last one of your misdeeds to the world." For a moment, it looked like Braden might actually see reason. His shoulders slumped, and he opened his mouth as if to speak. But then that familiar arrogance flickered across his face, and he sneered. "You think you've won, don't you, Melina? Well, you're wrong. I'm not going to let you steamroll me like this." I shook my head, a sad smile tugging at my lips. "I'm giving you one last chance, Braden. Don't throw it away." But it was too late. His ego had taken over, blinding him to the reality of his situation. With a defiant glare, he pushed the documents back across the table towards me. "Do your worst," he spat. "I'm not backing down." And just like that, his fate was sealed. With a heavy heart, I gathered the papers and stood, my hands trembling ever so slightly. "So be it," I said, meeting his gaze one last time. "You've made your choice, Braden, and now you'll have to live with the consequences." Without another word, I turned and walked away, already steeling myself for the battle ahead. The road to revenge would be long and arduous, but I was ready. Braden had brought this upon himself, and I would see it through to the bitter end, no matter what it took. True to my word, I filed the lawsuit against Braden the very next day. As the news of his misdeeds spread like wildfire, the consequences were swift and merciless. Overnight, his precious Airbnb business came crashing down around him. Guests canceled their reservations in droves, leaving scathing reviews that tarnished his once stellar reputation. Even our own friends and acquaintances began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with such blatant deception. And that was just the beginning. As the details of Braden's betrayal made their way into the local media, his name became a byword for greed and untrustworthiness. Reporters hounded us relentlessly, eager for the juicy details of our marital strife. "How could you do this to your own wife?" they would ask Braden, shoving microphones in his face as he tried to slink away. "Do you have no shame?" To his credit, Braden tried to put on a brave face, spouting off excuses and deflections like a broken record. But the damage was already done. His lies and misdeeds were laid bare for all to see. As for me, I found myself torn between a sense of vindicated triumph and overwhelming sadness. On the one hand, I had finally taken a stand against Braden's betrayal, refusing to let his actions go unanswered. But on the other, I couldn't help but mourn the loss of the man I had once loved, the man he used to be before greed and desperation twisted him into someone unrecognizable. "Are you happy now, Melina?" He sneered at me one night, his eyes blazing with anger and resentment. Is this the revenge you wanted? I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be cowed by his vitriol. I didn't want any of this, Braden. You brought this on yourself. And it was true. As much as his public humiliation and ruination brought me a twisted sense of satisfaction, it wasn't what I had truly wanted. All I had ever desired was for him to be honest with me, to respect me, and the things that mattered to me. But Braden had made his choices, and now he would have to live with the consequences. As the weeks dragged on, the strain of the ongoing legal battle began to take its toll. Braden grew increasingly desperate, lashing out at me and anyone else who crossed his path. His once thriving business was in shambles, and his financial resources were rapidly dwindling. Yet, through it all, I remained resolute. I had come too far to back down now, and I refused to let Braden's tantrums or empty threats deter me. This was about more than just money or possessions. It was about reclaiming the shreds of my dignity and self-worth that Braden had so callously trampled on. And in the end, I knew that no amount of revenge could ever truly heal the deep wounds his betrayal had inflicted. But it was a start, a bitter, bittersweet start towards rebuilding the life he had so carelessly torn apart. The day of reckoning finally arrived, and the courtroom was packed to the brim with spectators, eager to witness the final act of our bitter drama unfold. As I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, I could feel the weight of Braden's glare boring into me from across the aisle. His expression was a twisted mask of anger and desperation, a far cry from the cocky, self-assured man he had once been. But I refused to let his intimidation tactics get to me. Not this time. The proceedings were swift and merciless, with Delia methodically laying out the evidence of Braden's misdeeds, the financial records, the guest testimonials, even photographs of the unauthorized renovations he had made to our home. Braden's lawyer, a sleazy-looking man with a cheap suit and a greasy comb-over, tried his best to poke holes in our case. But Delia was razor-sharp, dismantling his feeble objections with a cold, clinical precision that left him sputtering and red-faced. As the hours ticked by, it became increasingly clear that Braden's fate was sealed. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the judge's impassive expression spoke volumes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. On the count of breach of contract, we find the defendant, Braden Grayson, guilty. A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, but I remained motionless, my heart pounding in my ears. On the count of emotional distress and betrayal of trust, we find the defendant, Braden Grayson, guilty. Braden slumped in his seat, his face ashen as the gravity of the situation finally hit him. And on the count of unauthorized sale of personal property, we find the defendant, Braden Grayson, guilty on all charges. A cheer erupted from the gallery, but I couldn't bring myself to join in the celebration. Instead, I turned to look at Braden, our eyes meeting for one final, charged moment. In his gaze, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Regret. A silent acknowledgement of the pain and destruction he had wrought, not just upon me, but upon himself as well. But it was too little, too late. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order in the courtroom. Mr. Grayson, in light of the evidence presented in the jury's verdict, I am ordering you to pay compensatory damages to the plaintiff in the amount of... He rattled off a staggering figure that made my head spin. But that wasn't all. In addition to the financial compensation, the judge stripped Braden of his ownership rights to our home, leaving me as the sole proprietor. It was a crushing blow, one that left Braden reeling and gasping for air like a man drowning. As the courtroom erupted into chaos, with reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing, I felt a strange sense of numbness wash over me. I had won. After months of pain and struggle, I had finally emerged victorious, with Braden's lies and betrayal laid bare for all to see. But as I watched him being led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't the man I had married, the one who had once promised to love and cherish me through thick and thin. No, that man was gone, replaced by a twisted shadow of his former self, a man consumed by greed and ego who had sacrificed everything for the hollow promise of success. And as I stood there, surrounded by the chaos, I couldn't help but wonder, was this victory worth the price I had paid? In the weeks following the trial, I threw myself into the task of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. with Braden's legal ownership of our home revoked, I was finally free to undo the damage he had wrought. The first order of business was to strip away every last vestige of his ill-conceived Airbnb venture. Out went the sleek, soulless furniture he had filled the house with, replaced by the warm, familiar pieces that had been a part of my family for generations. Next, I set about restoring the spaces he had so callously renovated, undoing the superficial changes he had made in his pursuit of profit. It was a cathartic process, each swing of the hammer and each coat of paint serving as a symbolic reclamation of what was mine. But it wasn't enough. As I stood in the empty space where my beloved camera collection had once stood, a sense of profound loss washed over me. Those cameras had been more than just possessions. They were a tangible link to my family's history, a legacy that Braden had so carelessly severed. That's when the idea struck me. A way to not only honor the memory of those lost heirlooms, but to ensure that their stories would live on for generations to come. With a portion of the settlement money I had been awarded, I set about transforming that empty space into a small museum, a shrine dedicated to the preservation and appreciation of vintage cameras and photography. It was a labor of love, one that consumed me for months as I scoured antique shops and online auctions for rare and historically significant pieces to add to my growing collection. And as the museum took shape, piece by piece, I felt a sense of peace and purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. This was my revenge, my ultimate act of defiance against Braden's selfish actions. Where he had sought to erase my past and strip me of my identity, I was creating something lasting and meaningful, a legacy that would outlive us both. The grand opening was a modest affair, attended by a small but devoted group of photography enthusiasts and local supporters. As I cut the ribbon and welcomed the first visitors into my museum, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride and accomplishment. This was my sanctuary, my fortress against the cruelties of the world, a place where the ghosts of the past could be celebrated and cherished, rather than discarded and forgotten. And as for Braden, well, he had been relegated to the fringes of society, forced to rebuild his life from scratch with a tarnished reputation and a humbled ego. I caught glimpses of him from time to time, shuffling through the streets with his head down, a shadow of his former self. And in those rare moments, our eyes would meet, and I could see the flicker of recognition, the silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired between us. But I never felt the need to gloat or revel in his downfall. My revenge had been served, not through petty schadenfreude, but through the simple act of reclaiming my life and my identity. As I stood amidst the carefully curated displays of my museum, surrounded by the timeless beauty of captured moments, I knew that I had finally found peace, and that, in the end, was the sweetest revenge of all.